Hey guys, it's Navinad. Just wanted to get back to the Silver Bullet series and discuss the concept of polarization. So, what is polarization? A range is said to be polarized when it doesn't contain any middle strength hands. It is very big value hands and error or bluff type hands completely. There's no in between. So if we were to 3-bet a polarized range pre-flop, we would maybe take whatever our continuing range was going to be facing an open raise, and we might take the very top of the range and the very bottom of the range and 3-bet those hands and flat call with the middle section. Percentages depending on the situation and depending on things like stack size and therefore the size of the bet based on the size of the pot we want to create, etc., so on and so forth. So the nutted value part of a polarized range is going to be pre-flop. It's going to be the hands basically that you're willing to go with. So if I'm 3-betting from the button against a pretty good loose aggressive open from cutoff position, I'm going to flat call a lot. I'm going to flat call a lot of the hands that are ahead of my opponent's opening range, but that are not going to be ahead if my opponent decides to call my 3-bet or 4-bet me if I decided to 3-bet those hands instead. So I'm going to flat call the middle portion that is ahead of my opponent's range, but only, only marginally. So, or really only ahead of my opponent's opening range, but not ahead of my opponent's continue versus 3-bet range. I'm also going to take the bottom of that range, of my continuing range. So that would be the hands that are almost good enough to continue with, almost good enough to call with, rather. And I would take the most appropriate hands of that nature, and I would 3-bet those. So maybe I'm 3-betting, King 7 suited, and I'm 3-betting aces, but I'm flat calling King Jack suited, for instance. So the value part is going to be nutted. It's going to be when we're in a situation where it makes sense to have a polarized 3-bet range. It can be pretty easy to play a polarized range because oftentimes if you're 3-betting polar, when your opponent decides to 4-bet you, you already know exactly what you're going to do, and it's not even close. You're going to continue with the value part of your range, and you're just going to throw the bluff portion of your range away. Now, it's going to depend also on whether you're going to want to have a balanced 5-bet range, and if you're, let's say you are going to have a 5-bet jam range, and it's going to be balanced, and the way you're sizing your bets and the stacked pots are such that once you 3-bet, if your opponent uses kind of a standard 4-bet, you've selected a sizing of 3-bet that if your opponent 4-bets, you will have exactly a pot-sized shove when you 5-bet, meaning you will give your opponent 2-to-1 on a call. And when you're offering your opponent 2-to-1, you've got to make sure that your balanced range is such that the equities work out essentially as they would if you were in a river situation with static equities offering your opponent 2-to-1, where you would be, in that case, you'd have 100% equity 2 times for every 1 time you have 0% equity. So you'd have like this 2-to-1 ratio. And this comes up pre-flop also, but it's a little bit more complicated because very rarely do you jam even a balanced range, and even if you get caught at the bottom of your range, if it's a polarized and balanced range and you get caught at the bottom of it, you're still not dead. You're not going to have 0 equity. So depending on how you structure your range exactly, the exact number of value hands compared to bluffs that you're going to have in that 5-bet range can vary, but just keep in mind that that is the range that you're balancing when you go back to your 3-betting and you're polarizing and balancing your 3-bets so that you have enough value hands and enough bluffs or light 3-bets to balance them out. Whatever your 5-bet range is going to look like, you are really just balancing enough value hands and bluffs to make your opponent indifferent or break even on calling with the bluff catchers of their range, like the middle part of their range. And I guess the point I'm trying to make, and this is a little bit complicated, but any of the hands, if you are going to have a perfectly balanced GTO 5-bet shoving range, and there's going to be a light portion of that range and the value portion of that range, let's say you end up with 2% of the deck that you're shoving, your 5-bet shoving in whatever spot. When you're 5-betting that 2% range, and some of it is going to be light, if you're going to have a balanced 3-bet range, you're balancing it to include enough bluffs to balance out not against the actual value portion of your 5-bet range, but of the entire 5-bet range, which is I think that's a subject that's going to become a little more clear as we move through the rest of this video. We're going to come back to that at the very end, so I'm sure if you're not really familiar with this concept, that's not going to be super clear, but I've got a little easier example of it at the end of the video here, so stay tuned, it'll make sense at the end. Okay, and here's a little exercise, and I recommend that you actually take a deck of cards and just maybe, you won't be able to do exactly this, but you could take like all of the aces and jacks from a deck and put them in one pile or one little mini deck, and then take all the kings and queens from another deck, and you can kind of emulate this game here. So in the half street hold'em, this is it's a toy game. The rules are 2 players each ante $1, and each one has a deck that is either 100% bluff catchers or 50% bluffs and 50% nuts. So if player 1, or player A, I guess, however you want to say, player 1, if player 1 has a deck containing all kings, he's just got a deck of 52 kings, player 2 has a deck that is 50% aces and 50% queens. Okay, so the players are going to alternate being the button, and each player, so they're going to be in position. So each player is going to just get dealt 1 card at random from their own deck, and so one player is going to get the king, of course, and the other player will get either the ace or the queen. They'll get each 50% of the time. The player that is out of position checks, has an auto check option, a forced check option, and then the player that's in position for this half street or this half street hand, will have the option to either bet the size of the pot or check back. If he checks back, the hands are tabled, the best hand wins the showdown. If that player bets, then the other player has to decide to either call or fold. And if he folds, he surrenders the $2 in the pot. If he calls, then if his hand is good, it wins the total pot, and if his hand is beat, then he loses the total pot. So if player A has the deck of all kings, you can think of him as having the bluff catcher range. If player B has the aces and the queens, you can think of that player's range as being polarized. So this is the toy game we'll be referencing, and this is the answer. This is how we would play. This is the correct answer. No matter whether you're you have the option to bet or not, if you have the deck of kings, you never use your bet option. The kings are always going to check. If you are in position for this half street or this hand, and you have the king, you can't make money by betting into a player that's got a polarized range, right? Because if you bet a bluff catcher into a polarized range, then they're not going to pay you off with worse, and they're not going to fold better, so you're just setting money on fire. So the kings are always going to check. That's whether they're in position or out of position. When ranges are significantly polarized and significantly bluff catcher heavy, there is really no positional advantage. That's kind of an interesting concept. It's a sort of an epiphenomenon of this polar versus bluff catcher scenario, and it stems from the fact that the player who has a polarized range always has incentive to bet, and the player who has the bluff catcher range never has incentive to bet. So the solution is going to be this. The king is always going to check to the player that's either going to bet or not. If actions check to the player with the king, he always checks back. And when he does knuckle back in position, he's going to win half the time if he's in position and he has the only option to bet, because his opponent will either have the ace or the queen. If the player that has the ace and the queen is in position and does not have the forced check option, he has the option to bet or check back, he will always bet his aces and he will bet his queens one half of the time. So if he's got, the right distribution, as there would be in a standard kind of deck, a quarter of them are clubs, a quarter of them are spades, a quarter of them are hearts, a quarter diamonds, then maybe he would elect to bet with all of his black queens and check back all of his red queens. So that's the correct answer. The correct answer is the player who's playing the polarized range of aces and queens will always bet his value hands, his aces, hoping to get called by the king, and he will sometimes bluff his queens, hoping to get a fold from the queen or from the king, and really trying to make the player who's playing the deck full of kings indifferent or breaking even on his bluff catchers. So if we're bluffing 50% of the time and we're value betting all of the time when we have the nutted value hand, and we're using a pot size bet, then since we are risking one pot size bet to win one pot size bet, the king's response to make us indifferent between bluffing or not bluffing is going to be to call half the time and fold half the time, and that makes it kind of not matter if I bluff the queen or not in that hand, because the king's going to fold half the time, the king is going to call half the time. The player betting the queen is risking $2 to win $2. It's going to work 50% of the time, so he's really indifferent between bluffing or not, as long as the player who's got the kings is using his best response, which is to call half of the time. So where's the advantage come out of this? It comes from the times that the player with the aces or queens actually holds the ace. You can see here that having the polarized distribution is far more valuable than having the bluff catcher distribution. Even though in pure EV, in pure equity I should say, the players are even money, right? I mean, if you're playing a deck of kings and I'm playing a deck of aces and queens, we are 50% likely to win the hand if it just goes to showdown. But the fact that we're able to bet a polarized range is what gives a polarized range its sting. We're able to bluff and we're able to value bet. The fact that we can break even on our bluffs by betting them half of the time and betting our value hands all of the time means that we can beat the kings, or at least break even, I guess, conceptually, we can break even against the kings and win with our aces. So our aces are supposed to beat the kings, but our queens are supposed to lose to the kings. But if we have a well-balanced strategy and we have a polarized distribution, we can make our queens break even against our opponent's kings, and we can still make sure that our aces turn a profit against our opponent's kings. And that's really the heart and soul of polarization, and that's why it is such a devastating weapon to wield, especially in a no-limit betting scenario. So let's look at this game and some of the strategies players might choose to try to see if I can kind of drive this home, why it is so much better to be the player playing the aces and queens than the player playing the kings. So let's say the player with the kings decides, his opponent is probably just going to bet when he has an ace, so every time his opponent bets, he's just going to fold. Well, if the player is actually using, if the player with the aces and queens is actually using a balanced GTO strategy, he's not going to never bluff. He's going to be bluffing with half of his queens, and he's going to be value betting. So he's going to be betting a total of 3 out of 4 times. And if he's betting a total of 3 out of 4 times, and his opponent with the kings folds every time he bets, then he's going to auto profit with his bluffs, and he's going to make too much money with his bluffs. He's not going to make as much as he should with his value hands, but he's still going to run over the player with the kings because the player with the kings is not calling enough to make him indifferent or breaking even with his bluffs, with his queens, that is. So let's say down below this on the bottom left, the player with the kings figures, villain either has an ace or a queen. It's 50-50. The pot's laying me 2-1. By the time he bets his $2, there's 4 in it. It costs $2 to call, so I'm getting 2-1 on a 50-50 shot, so I call. And the problem with that idea is, if the player with the king always calls, he's going to lose his $1 ante and $2 call 2 out of 3 times, whenever the ace-queen bets. The player that's playing the aces and queens, when he bets and the king calls, since the player is only betting the queens half of the time but betting all of his ace combos, then he will be value betting 2 out of 3 times. So he's betting 3 out of 4, but he's value betting 2 of 3. And what that means is if the player reasons, well, I'm getting 2 to 1, so I should just always call with my kings, that's actually not correct. That is correct with regard to villains, or well, with regard to the ace-queen player's bluffs. He is breaking even on his bluffs because he's getting laid 2 to 1, and he is going to break even against the villain's bluffs. So bluff catcher is going to break even against bluffs, and that leaves the value hands. The aces are going to make all the money. So the function of the bluffs in a GTO balanced strategy are really just to break even, but you're breaking even in situations where you ought not break even. You shouldn't be able to break even because you've got the worst hand, but because you've got this balanced range of very nutted value hands and bluffs, the nutted value hands allow your bluffs to break even. And having bluffs in your range allow you to maximize your value with your value, the value part of your polarized range. If the king player decides to just randomly call half the time, yeah, that's exactly right. That's what he ought to do. If he calls half the time, folds half the time, then that makes the player with the ace-queen deck, we're going to call him hero from now on, it makes hero indifferent between bluffing or not in any given hand, and it makes sure that the player who's playing the bluff catcher, the villain, I guess in this case, with the kings, cannot do anything, or, well, one can't do anything to make more money. They can't alter their strategy in any way to make more money or lose less. So this game reaches a Nash equilibrium when the player with the kings decides to fold half the time at random and call half the time at random, and the player with the ace and queens decides to bet all of their aces and half of their queens. Hopefully that makes some sense. If not, really just get the deck of cards out and just have, maybe however you want to split the deck up, just make sure that you've got one deck of cards that is middle hands that beat 50% of the cards in the other deck and lose to 50% of the cards in the other deck. And set up some chips and play it out. And if this isn't making sense to you right now, it will after you just do this a few times. You'll realize that the guy that's playing a deck full of kings against the guy that's playing a deck full of aces and queens is really at a very big disadvantage. And the disadvantage really comes from the idea that the player with the ace and the queen can effectively see his opponent's cards, but the player that has the king cannot see his opponent's cards, and there's betting left. So anytime there is wagering and one person has better information than the other person, the person that has better information is going to be able to set up a strategy with his betting that's going to allow him to make money. And that's what's happening in a polar versus bluff catcher situation. The player with the polarized range is able to bet effectively because he can, for all intents, see his opponent's cards, but the player with the bluff catcher range, while he is 50-50 in equity, is unable to leverage the fact that his hand is stronger than his opponent's when it's a king versus queen matchup, because betting in any way is going to be negative EV. There's no bluffs and there's no value, so he's stuck guessing, and that's where the sting comes from when you're playing a bluff catcher heavy range that is very capped in some way. It's one of the dangers of capping your range against a good thinking player is exactly this idea, that if you 3-bet, let's say pre-flop, get called, and you've got pocket kings and the flop comes out ace 7 deuce rainbow, and you're in position as the pre-flop 3-better, when your opponent checks to you and you check back, you've capped your range. And your opponent can then go into a very exploitative strategy by just really bombing the turn and jamming, even overbet jamming the river with a polarized range of any hands that are stronger than your kings as essentially the nuts, and that'd be the value or nutted portion of his value range. And then enough air to balance out based on the pot odds that he's laying with his bet sizing. So when it comes to having a polarized range, the bigger the bet, the better. But you want to be able to get maximum pressure and maximum efficiency over multiple streets. So we'll talk about how to construct your betting size and how it adds up in a pot geometric sort of way. Again, at the end of this video. But this is the problem here. When we cap our range, we allow our opponents to take lines that put too much pressure on us and make it impossible for our capped range to anything like break even in the long run against a player who is capable of polarizing, balancing, and bet sizing correctly. So here we go. Pre-flop, polarized, just to kind of nail it down exactly what polarized means again. Pre-flop is you're polarized when you're 3-betting like aces, kings, queens, and then like king 7 suited and all of your ace wheel suited. You know, just it's when you have kind of BS hands that aren't good enough to even call, and then nutted value hands that you're willing to go all the way to the felt with. That's a polarized range. When should you polarize? You should polarize pre-flop when your opponent's unlikely to flat call you. So if he's just going to fold a ton, then you don't necessarily want to 3-bet a merged range against him because you're kind of wasting your hands and turning them into bluffs. If your opponent's folding just a ton, say you're playing heads up and you're the big blind, and your opponent's folding to like 60% or 70% of your 3-bets heads up, then you probably don't want to take a hand like king queen and 3-bet it because you're almost turning that hand into a bluff. Or let's say that if your opponent is folding to more like 90% of your 3-bets, then you don't want to take a hand like king queen and 3-bet it because you're just turning it into a bluff because you're never going to get action from worse hands. You'd rather flat call with it, take a flop with that hand, and then use garbage hands to 3-bet, and then your nutted value hands like pocket aces and kings would be just the value end of your polarized 3-betting range in that scenario. Post flop, you want to take a polarized, you want to have a polarized response or take aggressive actions with the polarized range when you take a line against your opponent's bluff catchers. So when your opponent has essentially capped their range, that's the best time to polarize your range if you have the ability to do so or if it makes sense for you to do so. And a range is said to be polarized post-flop when it contains the nuts and nothing. So you take a line that reps either a big draw or another value hand and you get to the river, then you need to have a balanced and polarized betting response unless your opponent is going to start making hero calls, and then it can make sense to throw in some range merging once your opponent starts to hero call you. But that's a topic for another video. E.g., example given, the flop is Jack 8-3 two-tone, and say you called out of the big blind against a button raise. You check raise the flop, the 2 of heart comes on the turn, you bomb the turn pot sized, and the river is the queen of clubs. This is a very good situation for you to just go ahead and pile it in. If you've got a pot-sized bet behind, it's going to be very hard for your opponent to do anything about it. When he flat calls your check raise on the flop, he has capped his range. He doesn't have a set of jacks. He doesn't have 2 pair very often. He's capped his range usually at about 1 pair. And when you check raise the flop, you bomb the turn and you jam a relatively scary card on the river. If you're doing this with a range like all of your flush draws, all of your straight draws, and all of your sets on the flop, then by the time you get to the river, you're probably going to get there with a distribution that's about right for just bombing your entire range, whether that be the busted draws in your range or the it's going to be busted draws, the draws that did come in, and whatever value hands you check raised on the flop that are still legitimate value hands, like well, any set, and maybe Jack 8 would still be that might be dipping sort of into the range mergy side of things if you decided to take like non-top 2 pair, like second and third pair, and bomb the river with it. But I digress. Again, that's not one of the things we wanted to talk about in this video. So this P versus BC scenario that poker authors and mathematicians that are doing work related to know them and hold them like to talk about, stands for polar versus bluff catcher, and it describes exactly the situation that we've been talking about. All else equal, the player with the polarized range is in a it has a massive advantage. It's an informational advantage, is really what it comes down to. It's a situation where your opponent is just going to have to make more mistakes than you, just sort of by the nature of the game. There's not anything that they can do about that. It's in any P versus BC scenario, it's never okay for the bluff catcher range to bet, and it is often correct for the polarized player to bet. Pot geometry for polarized bet sizing. You reverse engineer your situation from the river on backward to the flop or even before. The bigger you bet, the more you can bluff, but you want to keep your bet sizing congruent. If you have the stack size to do it, you want to like check raise pot on the flop, bomb pot on the turn, and shove the river for one pot size bet. If that's how the math works out and the pot geometry works out that way, that's going to be the optimal bet sizing for a polarized range against the bluff catcher range. Here's an example. If hero calls, villains button open from the big blind with a range of pocket 2s through 8s, ace 10, ace 2 suited through ace 9 suited, king jack, king 10. Any of the king jack, king 10, if it doesn't say suit or offsuit, it means both suited and offsuit combos. So you can read the range there. The flop comes 7-6-2 two-tone. Hero checks. Button C bets half pot. Hero raises pot size. Button calls. Now this sets up stacks in such a way that if we make a pot size turn bet, and it gets called, it will leave one pot size bet behind an effective stacks for the river. That's GTO, pot geometric optimal bet sizing for a bluff catcher versus polarized range situation. When you have the polarized range, you want to move all in on the river, and you want to use, and even if it's an over bet, you want to go all in on the river, and you want to use bet sizes leading to the river that are as close to the same percentage of the pot all the way through. That's where you get your optimal line, and it's where you're able to get the most EV out of the biggest range of hands. That's what it comes down to, is the closer you're running to that pot geometric growth where you're actually using the same exact sizing on every street and then jamming the river for that same percent of the pot, what it boils down to is that's where you're allowed to use the most bluffs. And when you get to the river with a balanced range this way, and you jam a balanced range that is polarized, and say it's a pot size bet, and you're going to have this 2-to-1 value to bluff ratio, essentially all of your bets right there are equal. Essentially, when you get to the river with a polarized distribution, your opponent is indifferent between calling or not. In other words, in the long run, it just doesn't matter whether he folds or calls. Since it doesn't matter if he folds or calls, you may as well say he just elects to fold, and you capture the entire pot. So if you're balanced on flop, turn, and river, and you get the bet sizing right compared to the value to bluff ratio and the pot odds that you are up against yourself on your bluffs and the odds you're laying your opponent to call, then you can effectively set it up so that on the river your opponent has already lost what is essentially the size of the pot. And when you think of it in those terms, maybe pause and read this. I'll kind of describe it to you the best I can very quickly. But when you get to the river on some kind of run out where you've been very aggressive, so you wouldn't be doing this with like top pair or even an over pair, you're either repping the nuts or a draw that either got there or didn't, or some kind of set or quads on the turn in this example. When you get to the river, let's say that you have 20 combos for value, then you'll have 10 combos that are bluffs, and you'll offer your opponent 2-to-1 pot odds on the shove. That's perfectly balanced, and that's exactly what you want to do. So then you take those 30 combos, you back up to the turn. Because you have now 30 combos that are essentially value combos, you can balance those out by adding in 15 combos of bluffs on the turn. So then you're going to make it to the turn with what is essentially 45 combos that will be valuable, have the same value, the same EV by the time you get to the river. So you can splash in what, 22 and a half combos. So you have like 77.5 combos or whatever the math works out to be on the flop, so that you get to the river with the right number of combos to jam a pot-sized bet, having a 2-to-1 value to bluff ratio on the river. So pause, read this over, and for clarity's sake, pause and read this over. This is just explaining exactly the same thing that I just said, just with numbers that actually add up and make sense. So pause, read, and move on. Okay, so I know that was a little bit of a quickie, but again, this is in this series, I'm hoping this is going to get you thinking about the right questions to ask. So do that. Ask the questions. Polarized range, nutted value bluff, optimal sizing. We've talked about polar range versus bluff catcher. We know where the edge is there. I know it, and hopefully now you know it. So until next time, guys, Navanad, over and out, and good quote, Luck, end quote.